Yes, okay. Hello, everybody. Good afternoon. Thank you for coming. It's a great pleasure to introduce Professor Nicolas Weber, who is a senior faculty member at Fulbright University of Vietnam, our close friend and ally and collaborative partner. He's currently also a visiting scholar in the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations and the Center for East Asian Studies at University of Pennsylvania. And he specializes in pre-modern and modern Southeast Asian history, ethnic history, and diasporas, with a particular focus on the Chams and on Champa, which is a special interest to some of you here today. Professor Weber obtained his PhD from the Institut National des Langues et Civilisations Orientales, INALCO, in 2005, and the title of his dissertation was Contribution to the History of the Cham Communities in Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Siam, Malaysia, Political, Military, and Economic Integration. His publications include a 2014 book called Histoire de la Diaspora Cham, History of the Cham Diaspora, which I was just asking about. Apparently it's in the works to be translated into English, although some of you don't need it translated. That's good. He also co-edited reproduction of Cham manuscripts, which is fascinating. There's an enormous number of manuscripts now available thanks to the efforts of people like Professor Weber. His forthcoming article, also especially for the Vietnam Civ crowd, is called A Southern Game of Thrones, Nguyen Phuc Anh and Non-Viet Mandalas and Dominions Politics in the Early Nguyen Era, which is forthcoming. And his current book project is called Forbidden Voices, Silenced Memory, Forbidden Voices, Silenced Memory, and reconstructs a late 18th to late 19th century Cham history largely erased by modern Southeast Asian states, restoring Cham actors and perspectives to the histories of Vietnam and Cambodia. And this is the reason we're particularly delighted to welcome him, because he's speaking on a population that is largely invisible, especially to nationalist-oriented memories of history. So we're very happy to welcome. Please help me welcome Professor Weber to the stage.
Thank you very much, John, for your introduction. And I would like to thank you again for organizing this, and thank you for the generous invitation from the Weatherhead East Asian Institute, and thank you for Professor Ling Hang for coming today. I know it's the end of the semester, so it's been a bit busy for all of us. All right, and thank you for all of you for being here today. All right. So just before I begin, just for us to be on the same page, right, I would just like to give some very succinct information on who the Cham are. The Cham are one of the 55 ethnic minorities in Vietnam, right? They live in what is today south of central Vietnam, as well in southwestern Vietnam, along the Cambodia border. There is also a huge Cham community in Cambodia and a smaller one in Thailand as well, and an expanding one in Malaysia, right? So the Cham are Austronesians, right? So they share very strong cultural, religious, and linguistic affinities with the Malays. Well, the Chams are the heirs of the kingdom of Champa, right? So the kingdom of Champa used to stretch all over central Vietnam, right? And so the conquest of Champa has been like a very slow development, right? With conquest of territories, but more particularly with colonization of territories in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. All right. So let's move to our text. So if you don't mind, I will read my notes because it's quite a complex topic for me today. So for some time now, I've been working with a corpus of Cham verse narratives that never appear in mainstream accounts of Southeast Asian history. So the more time I spend with this text, the more I realize that they preserve some of the clearest and the most intimate insights we have into how Cham communities experienced the upheavals of the 19th century. Although I draw from a corpus of 15 narratives, today I want to focus on one text in particular, which is called The Rhyme of Looking Forward, or Arya Krang Anak in the Cham language. So this text is a narrative that attempts to make sense of a world collapsing in the 1830s, a world of annexation, dispossession, and the dismantling of Cham ritual and social life. What fascinates me about this narrative is not just how it describes the past, but how it refuses to stay in the past. More than a century later, in 1968, Cham communities turned back to this narrative when another moment of rupture arrived, that is the Vietnam War. And that return tells us something very profound about how memory works and how communities survive historical violence. So what are Cham verse narratives? So Cham verse narratives, Arya or Paruna in Cham, are composed in modern Cham, and they are meant to be chanted, right, or sung, right? So they're circulated not through state institutions, but through people. And because of that, they offer a kind of historical knowledge that is emotional, communal, and deeply human. I think of them as living archives. So these narratives function as a vernacular historiography. They capture what was lived, what it meant, and especially at moments when Vietnamese and Cambodian official records fall silent about Cham experience. So the form itself matters. So these Cham narratives belong to a Southeast Asian world where verse is used to tell history and to convey a sense of order. So if you're familiar with the Vietnamese Lục Bát 6/8, the Cham narratives from Vietnam share a loose rhythmic parallel. So of course, they're not identical, but they're close enough to suggest a shared regional sensibility around how verse carries history, memory, and moral meaning. So the form is not incidental. It's what gives those texts the power to carry memory, interpret rupture, and to remain living archives across generations. So Cham narratives are part of a broader Southeast Asia world of narrative verse texts used to record history, upheavals, moral questions, and communal experience. Here I would like to present two examples coming from the Malay world and Vietnam, the Shire city Zobaida, you can see on the right, and Doan Chung Tan Tan, there is a typo here, better known as King Bang Kiu. So let's listen to them.
Wahai anakku dasar bunda, berbuat baiklah di mana-mana, jangan dipilih mulia hina.
Now let's listen to the Vietnamese verse narrative.
Cờ ngoài vội vỗ rèm thế, xăm xăm băng lưới vườn khuya một minh.
So a side note, these two texts are, however, works of fiction, right? So they do not record history, but they revolve around the lives of two exceptional women, Siti Zubaida for the Malay text and Vung Thuy Kieu for the Vietnamese narrative. However, while they're not historical per se, they do convey a certain sense of order and moral. So seen this way, Cham narratives are not marginal, right? But they take part in shared vernacular ways of making sense of the past.
Wahai anakku jasmullah,
Sorry about that. So how to read these texts as archives? So Cham narratives function as living archives because they circulate through memory, performance, and copying, right? So it's both an oral and a written tradition. So they function as a vernacular historiography because they tell what official archives cannot and will not tell. And they function as moral interpretation because they help communities make sense of political, social, and spiritual ruptures. So by the end of the 18th century, Champa had been reduced to its most southernmost principality of Pandoranga or Tuan Tan, as the Vietnamese called it. But before its disappearance in the first half of the 19th century, Pandoranga was not a passive remnant. It was a useful ally that helped Prince Nguyen Phuc An, the future Emperor Yalong, forge southern power and defeat the Tyson. So when the Nguyen dynasty was established in 1801, the Cham king still governed, still held ritual authority, and still believed coexistence was possible. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So this is the Principality of Pandoranga, right? It's about 300 kilometers from Saigon. So the tragedy is that this particular political relationship was violently broken in the successive reigns. Minh Mang, who was the second emperor of the Nguyen dynasty and who reigned from 1820 to 1841, was not willing to permit any form of Cham autonomy. So his reign marks the decisive rupture. Minh Mang rejected the old model of negotiated authority and moved towards a more centralized, uniformed, and imperial order. The result was immediate resistance, of course, and open defiance. In 1832, Pandoranga was formally annexed. It was transformed in a Vietnamese province, and its institutions dismantled. Revolts spread across Pandoranga, opening the way for exceptional violence. At the same time, Cham in Cambodia were pulled into the Vietnamese colonization of Cambodia. Many were taken from Phnom Penh and from Kampong Cham province and resettled along the southwestern frontier in areas that are known today as Tai Ninh and Chau Doc. So each narrative emerges from a moment of crisis, civil war, imperial expansion, bureaucratic rationalization, annexation, and revolt. Together, they form a mosaic of what I call the Cham Century, a long 19th century marked by accommodation, erosion, dispossession, and the forced rearticulation of their identity. So on this slide, I would like to give the narratives that correspond to these moments, right? So the Arya Tunfor from 1796 to 1797, Arya Pocheng, early 1800s, Arya Pokantu, 1822, 1828, Arya Popok, 1828, 1832, Arya Taimai, 1832, 1835, and finally, Arya Klangana, 1835, 1837. So just to give you a sense of this range, the Arya Tunfor, for instance, captured the last stages of the Nguyen Phuc An and Tyson conflict. It follows a Malay adventurer who attempts to gather uplanders and lowland Chams into an upland Muslim polity. And this is an image generated through AI. Arya Pocheng depicts the early Nguyen Empire and shows how Emperor Yalong managed Panduranga as a semi-autonomous dependency. So each of the narratives give us a different perspective on how the period was experienced by the Cham. So they are not simply lamentations, right? They reveal how Cham imagined authority, negotiated sovereignty, and struggled to survive imperial expansion. So all of this brings us to the narrative that stayed with Cham communities more than any other, the rhyme of looking forward. So this narrative, composed after 1835, becomes the central text for understanding Cham memory of the 19th century. It condenses the experience of collapse into powerful imagery and depicts a moral world turned upside down. It carries the memory and identity of the Cham throughout the 19th century, and an identity that is tied to historical trauma. And strikingly, it returns in 1968. Among the other historical narratives, the rhyme of looking forward is one of the one that is one of the most circulated one. Numerous copies of this text have been found in Cham villages in central Vietnam. I, however, have to add that is also quite different from the other narratives because it's written in a very sophisticated and complex language, right? It uses very cryptic style and very multi-layered metaphors. So to understand the force of the narrative, we need to look at what Cham communities were living through in the 1830s. So following the annexation of Panduranga and the repression of Cham revolts in 1835, Pope Hoc-Thay, or Nguyen Van Thua, the then ruler, was captured by imperial soldiers and executed for treason. The Cham population was branded as disloyal and punished accordingly. Violence, displacement, and forced labor became the new normal. Beyond military violence, the imperial court attacked the foundations of Cham ritual and political authority. The imperial court sought to cut off its legitimacy and memory. This is the world in which the rhyme of looking forward is composed, a world where political, social, and religious structures collapse simultaneously. In the years following annexation, the Vietnamese administration undertook a systematic reorganization of Cham society. Villages were divided, land reassigned, elites removed and replaced by appointed Vietnamese officials. These policies didn't simply change who governed, they weakened kinship structures and changed everyday social life in a profound way. We also see significant religious pressure. Cham priests lost legitimacy and Vietnamese ritual practices were imposed. For the Cham, this was experienced as an attack on the moral world itself. The narrative captures the experience of a political, social, spiritual, and physical world being dismantled piece by piece. So let me show you how the rhyme begins. So this is the two opening stanza of the narrative. Nothing ahead or behind. Was there ever a reason to hold on to anything? Destruction wrought by anyone on every road from Panrang to Krong to Parik to Pajai. Spit turned into blood. So let me show you where the action takes place. Right? So it takes place in these four places. So I put the red dot, right? Phangrang, Panrang, right? Krong, Parik, and Pajai. So the poem opens with disorientation, right? Nothing ahead or behind. But this is not simply defeat, right? It is the collapse of a world in which direction, temporal, moral, social, has lost its meaning. The poem describes the event, so that is the annexation and the repression of the revolt, as a cosmic disaster. The celestial fire was unleashed and destroyed the country. 3 thunderbolts struck, their blasts shaking us to the core. The earth trembled in shock. Everywhere the trees were falling. We could hear the roar of thunder and the raging waves. The trees were shaking. Fallen trees everywhere, not beyond us, but here. So trees falling everywhere, that's not just landscape. It's a world collapsing under the weight of divine and human violence. And here we can see that nature mirrors the moral order as well. Right? The trembling earth is also a shaking conscience. But the trauma doesn't remain in the outer world. It also comes into the homes. They stood in the east, ready to strike before anyone could come. They tore apart our bonds and scattered us. We drank the sea's water to drain it dry. We could hear the thunder and the crashing waves. The trees were shaking. Elders no longer recognized their young, and maternal aunts could not recognize their nieces and nephews. So families were torn apart, kingship destroyed, and fear replaces recognition. So the narrative captures very well this psychological violence when neighbors accuse and kin no longer know one another. So it shows how conquest fragments not only villages, but the emotional fabric of society. And when people turn against each other, then the conquest is complete. The following stanzas describe how domination reshapes the land itself, how moral destruction becomes material. They first removed the buds, leaving the parent tree behind. They severed the roots and abandoned them. They destroyed the country's crops. They left the new governor of province to guard all the possessions. In every corner, they gathered what was ours. The crops they kept for themselves. To the 4 regions, they came to announce that the land must be arranged and stones set to mark the edges of the newly formed plots. So cutting roots, marking boundaries, these are acts of control. So the narrative sees land division as a kind of mutilation. It breaks the continuity between people, land, and ancestors. After land, the narrative turns to the sacred, where the rupture becomes almost absurd. They forced the ant to ride the elephant to look for instruction. They forced the dog to ride the tiger to go and look for the hunting game. They forced the rat to ride the pheasant to look for boats. So the metaphors here are strange and unsettling. Ants riding elephants, dogs riding tigers. This is deliberate. The verses show a world that has lost coherence and dignity, a world where everything feels abnormal and against nature. So here I will briefly explain the images. So the ants riding the elephant refers to the former nobility and royalty being forced by people of very low social class, right, to learn the Vietnamese language, right? The dog riding the tiger to go and look for the hunting game, that refers to priests that were being forced again by people of low status, right, to go to the forest and hunt animals and do things that they were not supposed to do, like kill animals and skin them. So what collapses next is meaning itself. They forced us to put the deity on altars and clasp hands in obeisance in the Vietnamese way. So one of the deepest traumas as reflected in this narrative is religious. People are forced to abandon their ritual universe and to perform worship in an imposed form. What is sacred becomes strange, even absurd. This inversion marks the collapse of meaning itself. At the same time, we see clearly what the imperial court was trying to achieve. Rituals are foundation of power and kinship. The non-performance of correct rituals is believed to generate chaos and punishment. So by targeting rituals, the imperial court sought to signal that the world order the Cham believed in had been destroyed and was never to return. It also placed Cham communities in profound anxiety. What would happen if they began to worship in Vietnamese forms and abandon their ancestors? So here in this verse, we have the information that Cham were forced to set up altars in their house and worship an idol. So I don't really know who this idol is. Is that a god, or is that a portrait or the tablet of the Emperor Ming Mang? I'm not sure, but it could be both actually. So and this is why this voice, the voice of the narrative, right, cannot remain in the 1830s, because the past comes back. The post-independent crisis in southern Vietnam mirror the 19th century one. The Cham, like the wider population of South Vietnam, are plunged into violence again, and their world is once more under threat. In this moment, memory becomes a form of resistance. It becomes a way to hold on to humanity. The past returns to warn, to guide, and to demand moral reckoning. The narrative endures because it offers a moral grammar for catastrophe, a way to understand what it means when a world is destroyed. And that grammar becomes meaningful again in the 20th century. But the imagery of collapse in the rhyme of looking forward did not remain in the 19th century. In 1968, it resurfaced as a way for Cham communities to navigate new forms of rupture. The mid-20th century again felt like the collapse of a moral universe with the partition of Vietnam and the Vietnam War. That year, Cham intellectuals republished the narrative not simply to preserve it, but to mobilize it. These people, these Cham intellectuals, right, were highly educated figures, deeply aware of Cham history and of the political pressures of their time. They merged the rhyme of looking forward with a second text on moral conduct. By doing this, they showed that remembering the past, they showed that survival required much more than remembering the past, but also required reaffirming the ethical foundation of Cham life. So this is the 1968 edition of the rhyme of looking forward, right? So you can see it follows like an European format. This is totally not traditional. This is the first page of the narrative. Here you have the title. Here the names of the intellectuals that edited the text, and here on the top you have the Om symbol, right? So the result was a text that read both as a warning and as a guide for how to endure chaos again. So we do not know how this edition of the text circulated, but it was likely intended for village networks, right? Not only private homes. So it was meant to function as a kind of moral handbook in a moment of fear and, of course, uncertainty. Oh, sorry. So the 1960s repeat the same moral disorder now through the politics of religion. In the early 1960s, Ngodin Ziem's regime turned religion into battleground. The Buddhist crisis of 1963, which culminated in the self-immolation of the monk Thich Quang Duc, revealed a profound breakdown. Religion was not only suppressed, but used as a political weapon. A space meant for compassion and moral order became a place of fear and control. This is exactly the same moral inversion the Cham narrative describes, a world where the sacred no longer protects, but is violated. So here you have the picture of the self-immolation of the monk and the protests. But rupture is not only external, it also comes from within. So in the same years, Cham communities were fracturing internally. Reformist Muslim leaders condemned Bani practices as unorthodox and pushed to reshape belief and religious life. So I had forgotten to mention that the Cham until the 1950s were divided into two religious groups, right? The Ahin and the Bani, right? So the Ahin is a localized Hinduism, right, with ancestor worship. And the Bani religion is a localized form of Islam mixed with deity and ancestor worship. Right. So in the 60s, these Bani communities was under attack by these reformists. So reformist Muslim leaders condemned Bani practices as unorthodox superstitions and pushed to reshape belief and religious life. Many of the reformists were influenced by wide currents of mainstream Islam. They had been educated abroad, like in countries like Malaysia, for instance. They were connected to new networks, and therefore they were seeking to align Cham religious practice with a more scripturalist vision. So here on this image, you can see what are the correct ways of praying, right, for the Muslims. So this is written in it's not written in Arabic, it's written in Cham. In Cham lands, new mosques were built as markers of reform. However, they also opened deep fractures within the Cham community. Cham customs clashed with Islamic orthodoxy and riots occurred. So the narrative sense of rupture, a world turning against itself, echoes this moment of religious discord. Meanwhile, in the Central Highlands, another familiar pattern takes shape. Assimilation policies carried out by the first government of the Republic of South Vietnam follow the familiar script: land loss, religious pressure, forced integration. Movements like Bajaraka and later Furo, the United Front for the Liberation of Oppressed Races, emerged to defend dignity and autonomy. For the Cham, these events reopened old wounds. The domination and erasure that began in the 1830s had returned in a new form. And the narrative gives voice to the memory of this recurring cycle of rupture. So at that point, silence is no longer possible, which brings us back to the narrative. In 1968, publishing this narrative became a way to speak when the world once again seemed to repeat cycles of collapse and erasure. Trauma must be remembered, not to reopen wounds, but to affirm dignity, meaning, and historical truth. So what do we do when a community's archive survives not through institutions, but through verse and memory? What kind of history becomes possible or even necessary? This is why Cham verse narratives matter. They are not supplementary sources, they are corrective ones. They preserve voices that official archives erase and memories that national narratives silence. They offer emotional and ethical frameworks for survival. What survives in this narrative is more than history. It is a moral imagination strong enough to face and live through the anxieties of an ever-changing world. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Professor Weber. That was an incredible talk, incredibly also applicable for our class as well. I have a few questions, but I do want to prioritize student engagement first, or audience engagement. Does anyone have a question immediately they'd like to ask Professor Weber? No, let me go. Oh, Alessandra, you're here. I think I know what you're going to ask.
Hi, Professor Weber. Thank you for being here today. It was a really informative talk.
Thank you.
I just wanted to ask, are these texts still performed and disseminated today? And also, if they are, kind of what does what might that look like? And where you talked about the Chams being in Malaysia and kind of have spread throughout different regions in Southeast Asia. So I'm just curious about what it looks like today.
Thank you. Thank you for your question. So nowadays, I mean, the tradition of performing this narrative, right, is dying, unfortunately, right? There are less and less people that are able to change these narratives. But when they are performed in a semi-formal setting, maybe after like a religious ceremony when people gather together. So that's the time where this kind of narratives will be performed, right? To reaffirm community links, right? So this happened in Vietnam, this happens in Cambodia as well. I haven't heard of people, Cham living outside of Vietnam or Cambodia performing these narratives overseas, right? Nowadays, I don't think, I could be wrong, but I don't think that these narratives are still copied, right? I don't think so. They might be, but we have quite a large corpus of narratives, so they survive. And the Cham themselves are very interested in keeping them, right? That's also how they survive.
Professor Weber, I'd like to invite you to sit if
Oh,
you'd like.
sorry.
Yeah. Here's a microphone over here. And
you. Thank you, Professor Weber, for being here. I am actually from like Indonesia. And so when you played that regulated, was it no, what it was a verse narrative. I could actually read like some of the title at least. The Perang China means fighting China. So that's really interesting. My question is, you played both the verses together. And I heard some similarities between how you pronounce certain words, the like gaps, the tone, things like that. As an expert within this field, are those similarities of interest to you?
Yes, definitely. uh, I'm not a specialist of performance, right, and verse recitation, right, but there are very strong similarities between various Southeast Asian traditions. And what strikes me the most is the similarities between Cham traditions and Vietnamese traditions, for instance, right? I mean, I don't know what John you think, right? But when I hear the Cham narrative, that reminds me of southern tunes, or like tunes that we can find in Vomko, for instance, or Kai Leung, right? So I think there's a shared way of performing poetry. Yeah.
yeah, I would love to ask you more about that. Our colleague Andrea Pham has recently written a book about the formation of the Guangnam dialect as deeply influenced by Cham language. So I was wondering as well if you had any observations or if you know of any explicit interactions or influences between Cham poetry and Vietnamese poetry, either in this narrative form or otherwise.
No, I haven't done any research on that. Well, when you have people living side by side, right? I mean, the mutual influence is inevitable, right? So I think that that's how it happened. But I think Vietnamese were quite very receptive to Cham influences, right? They were very willing to integrate parts of Cham culture into their own, right? Whether it be like cults or even some very particular cultural aspects, right? So I think that's also helped in having this kind of a shared heritage.
Other questions?
I was wondering about the forcible displacement of Cham people into Cambodia. Like, what was the process behind that? Was it similar to when the Vietnamese Empire was moving into former Cham territories and exporting like prisoners and such to initially settle certain areas, or were they like villagers? Did people try to move back to their hometowns after a period of time? Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much for your question. Yeah. So the Cham community in Cambodia had been, built over centuries, right? We believe that the first exiles happened in the 17th century, but there were continuous exiles from Champa to Cambodia from the 17th century to the 19th century. Now, the Vietnamese imperial court in the 19th century decided to extend its control not only over Champa, but over Cambodia as well. So from 1812, the Vietnamese imperial court installed a protectorate in Cambodia. And this protectorate actually became functioning as a colony, right? Very, very rapidly from the 1820s to 1848, it became a colony of Vietnam. So within that framework, Vietnam decided to move some part of the Cambodian population to Vietnam, right? Because it was extending its influence. So it also needed to strengthen some particular areas, especially those area located at the border, right? So that's how they imported. So if I can use that word, people from Cambodia to Vietnam. So that's how they displaced some Cham population from Cambodia to Vietnam. So they removed villages that were around Phnom Penh and some villages that were in Kampong Cham to Chao Dok and Tai Ninh. Were meant actually to protect, right? Protect both the protectorate of Cambodia, but also to protect the southern Vietnam.
That's a great question. Other questions? Audrey.
Thank you, Professor Weber. Earlier you mentioned that they are a declining group of people in most part of Vietnam and in, I believe, Thailand and Cambodia. Why is the reason that they're increasing in population in Malaysia? Is there like an underlying reason?
Because thank you for your question. Because the huge majority of Cham are actually Muslim, right? So they feel that Malaysia is a more hospitable place for them to live. And until very recently, Malaysia had a kind of very welcoming policy towards Cham groups, right? So because Malays believe that the Chams are part of their world, right? They are cousins. They feel very close to them, so they welcome them. Right? So there's an ongoing immigration to Malaysia, in Peninsular Malaysia.
Can I ask a quick question? Just it's a small detail question. So from one of the narratives you spoke about, not the looking forward one, but the main character is a Malay adventurer. So what is the sense of Malay in when it's used to describe that character? Is it Cham specific, or is it like a vague Malay identity, or?
It's more of a vague Malay identity, but it's someone that is both connected to the Cham world and also foreign.
It's just like a cosmopolitan Malay kind
Yeah.
of. That's fascinating. Here. Thank you.
You said that before there was like a lost, no, sorry. You said before that a lot of the Chams that practice Bani were streaming towards more mainstream Islam practices, I assume. And so I was wondering how that affects a Cham, an individual who's Cham, their identity, and like where does that like leave the Cham people going in the future, like as they immigrate to Malaysia and all that. Sorry.
Thank you very much for your question. Yeah, it's very interesting because those people who are opting to convert, right, to more orthodox form of Islam, they kind of also forget their historical identity as well. So that's what we observe in Malaysia, for instance, right? They kind of don't put so much emphasis on ancestors, of course, and land and history as much as what the Bani would do in Vietnam, right? So it's like changing religions means also changing identity. And in the case of Malaysia, there is a slight assimilationist pressure, right, for people to conform to what is believed to be, proper way of being and a proper way of being Malay and proper way to be Muslim, right? So there's also this tendency to, forget one's particularities, right? Cultural particularities and religious particularities. Yeah. A little bit, yeah, but yeah, I mean, it happens with other communities as well.
Yeah, I was interested in the 1968 republication that you had brought up. Was there any attempts to, like, I guess, reconsolidate or have any kind of acknowledgement towards the historical legacies of the Cham in Vietnam? And then, I guess, as like an additional question, obviously it was during the war, and I think you had brought up that it was the three different parallels. So what was the kind of reception to the republication and I guess like the effects of it?
Thank you very much. So I have to say that during the French colonial period, right, the French tried to use the Cham against the Vietnamese. So they tried to also to protect them. So during that time, they kind of gave them a lot of attention. They tried to preserve their history, and they also gave them a sense of, of dignity, right? Something that they had lost through decades, right? Because of the imperial policies. So what is interesting in the Southern Republic of South Vietnam, sorry, is that during that time, the Cham became more visible, right? So there were a few writers, a few intellectuals, Cham or non-Cham, that took the initiative to publish things in Vietnamese to inform the Vietnamese public of Cham history and Cham culture, right? So there was the beginning of, of how to say, of a way to being more visible, right? Sorry, I forgot your second question. Yeah. All right. Thank you. Yeah, actually, I have unfortunately no information on that. I've been trying to talk about Cham in the central regions, right? But all these intellectuals have unfortunately passed away. So I don't know how it was received. I don't even know how many copies were printed, right? But what I think is important is the effort that was that was done at that time, at that very particular time, in a very troubled time, right? It was war, right?
Nicola, do you know this dance performance that was choreographed by a Cham artist in Hoi An a few years ago? I think it's based on one of these narratives. Is it this exact narrative?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
It really is. Okay, so that's interesting. So there is some kind of publicity, at least in the present day. Let me ask a question, and since you brought up something similar to an interest I had, a question I had. Actually, it was inspired by Alessandra, one of our students yesterday. So I was wondering, I'm rechanneling a question Alessandra asked that I couldn't answer. In the colonial period, so you mentioned that the French colonial government did provide some attention to the Chams for multiple reasons. I was wondering if in the anti-colonial movements across Vietnam, was there any kind of engagement with the idea of the Chams particularly, or different groups like the Chams in the South, but specifically the Chams, to form a kind of, anti-French coalition, or was the sort of cultural political identities too, separated to allow that kind of coalition to form? Or, yeah, that's the general question.
So far, I haven't seen any traces of anti-French sentiment among the Cham, right? During the the struggle against the French. Yeah.
Yeah, that's interesting. Okay. It doesn't have to be.
Oh, wait, sorry, I'm just curious. Given that the French, as you mentioned, utilized the Cham, did they like also, since I'm a professor's fun class and the French were in Vietnam for spreading religion, did they try to forcefully convert the Cham? Because from the sounds of it, it doesn't seem like they have anti-French. Therefore, does it mean that they were not forced to convert, or were they forced to convert?
All right, that's an interesting question. So of course, there were missionaries, right? There were Catholic missionaries that were sent out throughout Vietnam, especially in the highlands, right, and in Cham regions as well. But the Chams were not really interested in converting, and there was no coercion in to convert, right? At least that's what I've been told. That's very interesting because in the late 60s and the beginning of the 70s, there was a priest from the foreign missions that was based in Cham villages, right? His name was Father Muse. He passed away some time ago, but he was like there as a priest, so he was mainly operating for the Catholic Vietnamese community in this region. But he was also very helpful towards the Cham community. So he helped to build a Cham cultural center in that region and collect manuscripts, right, to copy them and to publish them. He also published like a Cham Viet French dictionary, right? So he told me himself. He said, well, when I was in these regions, right, I talked about religion to the Cham, and they were not very interested, but they were very interested in getting his help to kind of promote their culture and save whatever they had. Yeah.
Yeah, the French were great preservationists. True. Oh, Jacqueline.
Hello, Professor. I have a couple of questions about the text. So, I'm curious about the recension history of the text. So, when does the first manuscript version of it date? And how does it kind of transform as it gets recopied? And also, you talked about how the 1968 reprinting kind of parallels what was happening during South Vietnam with the forced assimilation of the Cham during the Nguyen. But I was wondering if the sort of new set of circumstances in the 1960s would have caused a reevaluation of the Nguyen history, or whether the events of Nguyen history would have conditioned an interpretation of the 1968 version. Yeah. And sorry, one last question. I'm curious about the readership culture. So, is there anything in the text that would clue us in onto how a reader or an audience member might be expected to respond to the work?
Those are great questions. And I just want to add one to Jacqueline's set, because you did mention that the 1968 version is a merger with another narrative. So maybe you can also tell us a little bit about what the effect on the content is of this other sort of source that's merged together with, the narrative.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you. All right. So as for the date of the original, right, it's really hard to set because Cham manuscripts have no dates. Right? So we have no dates and no name of author, so we have no idea when they were composed. But we can say that some versions are more ancient than others because the most ancient versions are very short. Actually, it's like 50 stanzas. That's it. Right, and the longer version, like the 1968 version, are more than 120 stanzas. So we know that those ones come after 1960, 1968. So for your second question, So what the Cham intellectuals did, right, was not something revolutionary. It's actually part of a Southeast Asian tradition, right? A Southeast Asian textual tradition. It's customary for people who can read and write, right, to amend text, to most of the time expand them, right, according to the circumstances or according to the message they want to deliver, right? So that's what that was the intention. So, but what is very interesting is when we read that 1968 narrative, that 1968 text, right? It doesn't alter any of the stanzas, right? It's just that the texts are merged together, the historical text and the moral text as well, right? So both are actually clearly identifiable, right? But like I said, they did that to provide a guide, like a moral guide to the Cham community, right? So it's like we are going through chaos again. It's following something we have been through already. So this is, what we should do. Remember our past, but also, try to make sense of a world that is collapsing and try to reintegrate some kind of ethics in our lives. Yeah.
So the second text was composed in the 1968 newly for
No,
this new version, or?
No, I think that the second text was a kind of a traditional text. It probably comes from the maybe 19th century.
Okay.
Yeah.
But it's a sort of morality text
Yeah,
that's
it's
interesting.
moral,
Oh, that's very interesting.
moral teachings. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hi, sorry. I had a follow-up question on the question I think it was Audrey asked about the growing Cham population in Malaysia. And in Professor Fahn's class, we learned about the influence of Hinduism and Buddhism in Southeast Asia and Champa. But I was just wondering how, I guess further down the line in history, Islam came to be adopted by the Chams, and I suppose why that is.
Thank you. So there are various theories regarding the introduction of Islam in Champa, right? But I think one of the most credible one is that Islam was brought by the Malays, because in the past Chams were in constant, not in the past because they still are, but Chams were in constant contacts with the Malays, right? So Islam was brought to Champa by the Malays. Right? This is how it arrived in Champa, and this is also how they reformed their religion through Malaysia.
No, but I have a question on just how did the Chan script came about? Because in class we learned how the Vietnamese script came about and had a lot of like Chinese influence, and the current modern has a romantic influence. So what is the influence of the Chan script?
All right. Thank you.
Oh, and I want to add to that too. So when did the orthography of that 1968 modern Cham alphabet get developed? That's very interesting to me.
Yeah. All right. So the Cham script actually is a script that has been elaborated from a Southern Indian script, right? So there are, of course, the script evolved, right? So we have first the what we call the ancient Cham that was used in inscription that looks very different from what I've shown you. And we have what we call the modern Cham, which actually appeared in the 17th century, right? And which is still used nowadays, right? So that modern Cham is actually less complicated than the ancient Cham. Right?
And so was that 1968 text, was that typed?
No,
okay.
it was, what's the term? Mimeograph?
Oh, it was a mimeograph. Okay.
Yeah.
So there wasn't any, Cham, as far as you know, was never developed until before modern times for telegraph or typewriter or any of those types of technologies.
There was, but it wasn't used by the Cham yet. It was used by some French scholars outside of Champa, right? So this came much later.
Okay, that's fascinating. Yeah. Other questions? Oh, yeah. Lee. Can you have that to be for me? Oh, you got it. Okay.
Hi. I'm sorry, I came in slightly late, so I don't know if this was already addressed, but I find that the Vietnamization of Ponagar is very interesting. How Tini Ana is now part of the Vietnamese mother goddess worship. And I'm just wondering what your take is on Tini Ana and the worship of her coexisting with the worship of Ponagar still, especially Nha Trang. I'm from Nha Trang, born and raised. So there's still the temple is there, and there's still a yearly worship of her. So I'm just wondering, how does that coexist, and how does that conflict actually, or does it conflict, or how do the Cham feel about Tianiana, or like, yeah, the Vietnamese worship of her?
Thank you for your question. So, from what I understood from my Cham friends, right, the Cham have no problem with the Vietnamese adopting Ponaga as one of their the goddesses, right? The thing that they resent the most is that the temple and the statue itself have been Vietnamized, right? And the worship is conducted in a Vietnamese form, right? They offer incense, fruit, and all, not in a Cham way. So it's like they're kind of dispossessed of their their goddess. And so I don't think you will see Cham people nowadays going to Ponaga and pray, because it has been taken over, unfortunately. Right? So that's a point of contention. It's like the reappropriation of Cham temples and sacred sites. Yeah.
That's really interesting. It's happening within, with the United Buddhist Church. It's also happening within Vietnamese Buddhism as well, that similar phenomena. So where do Chams, like what for Chams who, well, I know most Chams are Islam, but where, other than, non-Islamic forms of worship, where do they prefer to conduct those types of worship then, if they're dispossessed of these sort of legacy sites?
So there are other temples in central Vietnam, right? There's one that is dedicated to Shiva, if I'm not mistaken, right? Which is called Po Krong Karai, and which hosts an annual big celebration that is called Kate. But they have also some shrines in the villages, right? Or some small temples where they can perform ceremonies. Yeah.
Yeah, fascinating. I have one question if no one has an immediate question. So as you were talking, your main idea or your main argument about these narratives as a form of corrective memory was really striking. It also is very strikingly parallel to, that practice among the Vietnamese in their own narratives of trauma. You mentioned the Tale of Kieu. The Tale of Kieu resurfaces in almost exactly the same way for almost exactly the same reasons. So I was wondering if you can speak kind of generally. This is also channeling another one of our students who's interested in Viet Thanh Nguyen's Nothing Ever Dies. So in Nothing Ever Dies, Viet Thanh Nguyen makes the strong argument that historical or like, there's a type of memory that is a kind of propaganda, and then there's a type of memory that can be corrective, that emphasizes this sort of dignity and humaneness as you described. And that type of memory does focus on traumatic experience as a corrective to state narratives, nationalistic narratives, and things like that. So I was wondering, especially in the case of Cham peoples, because their specific trauma is involved with the Vietnamese government. So how would you speak to the shared experience of remembering trauma for this particular purpose, given the political complexity of across Vietnamese and Cham people, Kinh peoples, I should say, and Cham peoples, given the specific political, context of the trauma? Yeah.
Yeah, that's that's an interesting question too. From what I've observed, right, the Cham just want to have a voice, right, in the national narratives. Vietnam has been built itself, over Champa and a part of Cambodia, right? So the Cham and the Cambodians, for instance, want some kind of recognition, because the national narrative just doesn't give them any voice, right? The national gives some dates. Okay, the conquest of this city and then the absorption of this territory, but it totally ignores, that people, were living there and were suffering, right? So what the Cham would like is like to have, their own version of history, right? Of course, some of the Cham would like to have their own kingdom or their own independence, but most of them, they just want recognition, right? They just want to have they just want the Vietnamese to accept that they have also been through trauma,
Yeah.
right? And that trauma needs to be heard as well, right? Not to create more trouble and to reopen wounds, right? But just to make sure that, well, everybody is heard, right? Everybody has been through war, everybody has been through dispossession. So the Cham have been, and they have a voice, and that's what they want to. I think that's what they want to say.
That makes a lot of sense. So I'm just very interested. It's a kind of meaningful point, so I wonder if you have any thoughts about how that dialogue could take place, since there is now a kind of dominant narrative of trauma of the 20th century, that, among King peoples particularly, but how do you imagine there to be created a space for that can coexist or can modify or, enrich, I don't know if that's the right verb, but the current sort of narratives of trauma and suffering that do focus on remembering the human suffering of that moment, but obviously from a particular King perspective. Like, can you imagine? Yeah, that's the question.
Yeah, I think. Well, Vietnam has done a lot of progress, right, in recognition of trauma, right, and accepting the war and its consequences, right. But the first thing to me is for the Vietnamese to accept their colonial past. That's the first step. That's the very first step for the Vietnamese authorities, the Vietnamese state to accept that it has been a colonial state for a period of time, right? So that's the first step. Then the next step would be, to try to publish, right, or to make visible, Cham, and not just, have their history or their traumatic experience retold by someone else. Right. So that's the next step.
That's great.
Like, does Vietnam currently have any like special holidays dedicated towards the Cham people, or is there no like, is there like overlapping holidays, or is it just like kind of like almost not a Memorial Day, but like something of the sort where it's like recognizing all of the different individuals and minorities within Vietnam?
Not that I'm aware of. Yeah, no, no, not yet. It might. I mean, it might change. Right? When I see the new generation in Vietnam, I mean, they're very open-minded and they're very also inclusive. Right? So they want to hear these voices, and they want also to participate to make these voices heard. Yeah.
This kind of relates to the last question. First of all, thank you. The talk was really thought-provoking. And I was wondering, in class when we discussed Min Maung's policy and his persecution of the Chams, one thing we talked about was how he kind of unified Vietnam into this more coherent like nation state. And so I was wondering, in like nowadays, is there any effort to create a more multicultural or inclusive nation state identity that people like the Chams could identify with?
I think there are efforts towards that. Yeah, definitely, right. The minorities become more visible, right. They are like part of a big Vietnamese family, right. They are all part of the of the same country. However, well, there's still room for improvement, I think, right? Because again, it's pretty much in the hands of the majority,
I wonder if you can just speak very quickly about Cham diasporic identity across the nation state boundaries of Cambodia, Vietnam, and Malaysia, and how much does that Cham diasporic or cosmopolitan identity, like how much of it is in the contemporary moment associated with, or maybe increasingly associated with, cosmopolitan Malay or Islamic identity?
Sure. So the Cham diaspora in Cambodia, right, is roughly divided into two groups. There is the Orthodox group, right, and there is also a form of Bani group. They have their own form of Islam Bani, but the Orthodox group is the largest, right? So the identity of the Cham diaspora is more Orthodox Muslim, and in that sense, is much more closer to the current Malay identity than any other identity. And the link to Champa of these Cham communities in Cambodia is not always obvious, right? Some communities would be emphasizing the link with the former kingdom of Champa. They would say our ancestors come from Champa, but other communities and communities that adopt more Orthodox Islam totally cut off themselves from that past.
Hi. So what do you think the effects of the rise of like nationalism and neo-traditionalism in Vietnam have the effects on recognition of the repression of the Cham community in Vietnam? I mean, you work at Fulbright, so you definitely know that there's a rise of like suppression of like our opinion or asking for the recognition of their past or experience. So do you have like optimistic or pessimistic about the future of, the Cham being recognized, because it's not the traditional history of Vietnam of recognizing themselves as the colonizer?
It's very directly asked.
By nature, I'm pessimistic, but from what I've seen in Vietnam, I'm rather optimistic. It's going to take some time, but I think I see change, and I see change in the new generation. Right? They don't really have the same. They don't have the same way of thinking the past as we do, as I do, or people from my generation or older generation, right? And they are more willing to accept, things that are uncomfortable, like recognizing colonialism, for instance, right? Or recognizing massacres or displacement. They are much more welcoming that as part of their history. So I think I'm quite optimistic with the new generation in Vietnam. Yeah. So I think it's going to change.
Especially students at Fulbright, particularly
Yes,
like that. Yeah.
I was gonna make a comment more so. Like, will this change happen? Like, I'm curious to know, like, I'm being a bit pessimistic, but like, will the change happen when it's too late? Like when when a majority of the Cham peoples have moved, like, or immigrated, or like, to Malays, and like, I don't know actually if that's like feasible to even say that it would happen, but like, I'm curious because it's like, if that change is to happen, like, it needs to happen more sooner than later, because due to the fact that like this identity is just like, it is disappearing, and the original like Cham identity is like, I don't know if it's actually critical to preserve, or like, I don't have opinion. This is like the first semester I've learned about Cham people, so like I really have very minimum to say about it, but I don't know, like, there's a part of me that's like, I want to preserve that, but at the same time you kind of have to let it go. Like, what's your thoughts on that? Like, will it come time? Like, will this change in Vietnam? Like, it's Dressing up as minorities. Sorry.
No, no, it's okay. It's just, I think.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hello, people. But will this what was I saying? I don't even know at this point. Preservation, yeah, but like, will it happen in time? Do you think it will? Are you optimistic that it'll happen in time before like there's no like undoing the damage that has been done in some ways? Do you understand?
Yeah. No, it makes sense, and unfortunately for me, there's no way to predict the future, right? It can go slowly, it can go faster. I don't know, but I think it's two very different things. I mean, the Cham are bound to assimilate anyway, like many other ethnic groups, many other, cultural identities, right? They are bound to assimilate in a broader Vietnamese or Cambodian identity. So that's one thing. But I think it's never too late to preserve. I don't think it's never. I don't think. Yeah, there's a a time stamp. It's like there's the limit. We cannot cross that limit. I think.
Yeah, I also think we should remember that the identity of the majority is also under our control. I mean, it is not something that's fixed. So we can take part in creating space or redefining that as it moves forward. So we are running out of time. I will have one last question. I think we should wrap up because Professor Weber has to go back to the hotel before we have lunch. But just one very simple question. Is there any plan for an English translation of this narrative to be published anytime soon?
Yes.
There is? Okay. Well, the Weatherhead does have a fund for translations, just in case you're interested. So let's thank Professor Weber for a really remarkable.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. Thank you, John.